I had the great fortune of knowing Professor Herman Stein back when I was a young associate professor, certainly much younger than I am now. And I knew him by reputation, but I also had an opportunity to work with him when he was serving as the provost of the university. And I learned a great deal from him as I saw him deal with very difficult issues in the university. But his response always centered on what was right for people and also keeping the integrity of the university center stage. He was a wonderful leader. And then as I encourage you to read through the document in front of you that describes his career, he's a person who devoted his life to those who are in need. He worked on the international stage, taking major steps, particularly after World War II, to help resettle people who've been driven from their homes. And he continued that work throughout his career. He came in 1964 as dean of what was then the School of Applied Social Sciences, and had a vision for the school to take it to another level. Made a number of critical hires of faculty who went on to become distinguished scholars and who helped lead curriculum innovations in the school. He then moved into higher level academic posts at the university, serving twice as provost of the university, including during the tumultuous Vietnam War era, where he helped keep this a much calmer campus than it perhaps would have been without his wisdom and leadership. I'm not going to formally introduce the speaker today, but I'll say that a special part about our speaker is that he was also a student of Herman Stein. And I know if Herman was here today, Professor Yadama, he would be very proud to see you here and to know about your accomplishments over this long period of time. So it's particularly personally touching for me knowing about your long history with him and the influence that he's had on you and how really you've carried out his legacy throughout your career. I also want to introduce you today to a special member of our audience, and that is Naomi Stein, the daughter of Herman Stein. Naomi, would you say wave to people? Okay, thank you. Obviously it's a pleasure to welcome Naomi here, and she was always with her father during those years. We saw them often together, and now you're carrying on his spirit in the room. And as I look out, I feel as if Herman is here with us in this room. So thank you for coming out today. This endowed lecture was designed to honor Dean Stein, to bring to you an outstanding thinker or international advocate to this school, to stimulate lively discussion, inspiring all to consider issues of community, compassion, and democracy around the globe. Dr. Yadama has been here already for a day. He already had a stimulating discussion with a group of students. Any students here who were part of that discussion? Oh, they've come back a second time for this. I've heard that was a very stimulating discussion. It continued into the evening, into what turned out to be a very late evening. I'm sorry we kept you out, but a group of faculty also had dinner with him, and we all agree that was a very convivial evening itself. My job now is to turn the microphone over to the person who will introduce you to Dr. Yadama. But I want to say that a distinction that Professor Stein held at the university is that he and Norman Robbins, a Nobel laureate, were the first people given the title of Distinguished University Professor. So we had a Nobel laureate, and we had Herman Stein, who really, in our social work profession, was really at the same level in terms of his international recognition. We all thought that title was going to be retired with Herman and Norman, but the university decided that they wanted to continue that distinguished title with people who indeed had the same level of impact through their work, not only in Cleveland nationally, but also internationally. And in the first cohort of people to be named Distinguished University Professor was our own Professor Terry Hockenstadt. So again, it's very fitting that Professor Hockenstadt, Distinguished University Professor, should be the one introducing our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Gilmore, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker today. He and I both were students of Herman Stein. I was a student of Herman Stein a little bit earlier than he was at Columbia, but obviously Dr. Yama had a chance to be under Herman Stein's tutelage here at Case Western Reserve. So we both learned a great deal from those experiences without question. Our speaker today is coming home. Dr. Gautam Yadama is now Dean of the School of Social Work at Boston College. But he was here for quite a while because he received both his MSSA degree and his PhD degree from MSAS, Case Western Reserve. And his wife, Shanta, is also an alumni of Case Western Reserve and MSAS. So indeed, he is coming home to friends today, and we're very pleased about that. But since he left the university, he has had a very distinguished career. Much of his career was as a professor at the George Warren Brown School of Social Work, Washington University, St. Louis. He also served as Associate Vice Chancellor for International Affairs, India, during his time there. And certainly in his many years there, he engaged in his professional career, both in terms of his teaching and his writing. He is internationally respected researcher. He has done interdisciplinary work on understanding the social and environmental challenges of the rural poor in South Asia and China, India, Nepal, and China, as well as some of the Central European countries. Currently, he is collaborating with the Center for Economic and Social Studies and UNICEF in India to leverage system science for the understanding of child and maternal malnutrition. He also is engaged in a number of other research projects, which I'm not going to go into great detail about, but to say that one of them include a study in China that's directed at the understanding the way rural communities engage in collective action. Some of his research is reflected in a major publication, his book entitled Fires, Fuels, and the Fate of 3 Billion, State of the Energy Impoverished, and that's an Oxford University Press publication, one of certainly many publications, but I think a particular note in terms of our program today. So it's really great for us to welcome Gao here for the Stein Lecture. Please join me in welcoming this double alumnus back to Case Western Reserve University. I present to you our speaker, Dr. Gautam Yadama.
I guess can you hear me? Yes. Because it's being controlled elsewhere. You know, part of this issue of having someone control your microphone is one of agency. So I was worried about that. Thank you so much, Dean Gilmore, Professor Hockenstadt. You know, once a professor, always a professor. It's very difficult for me to bring myself to call my professors by their first names. I know that is not the trend because people meet you and 30 seconds later they're calling me my first name. And I just can't get myself after 30 years to call some of my professors by their first name, but sometimes I'm compelled to do it because they insist on it or they're just so wonderful. I also want to say a couple things before I start. You know, I think it was Golda Meir, when I was listening, Golda Meir very famously said about, you know, and I'm not going to say anything about the introduction though of me given. I'm a product of this institution, and I think it speaks well of my faculty that have trained me and speaks very well of SAS, MSAS, and CASE. Golda Meir once said, you know, don't go on because you're not so great, don't be so humble. So I always take that advice. Before I just move to the lecture part, and which is really going to be focused in a big way around the arguments I've put forth in the book that was just mentioned, Fire's Fuel and the Fate of 3 Billion, and make a case for transdisciplinary science and translational work that we must do in the field of social work and broadly in the university. But before I go there, I'd like to thank Dean Gilmore for inviting me and for thinking of me for this. It's a very special thing for me to come and deliver the Herman Stein lecture, because I can never explain that to you, but you should just know it's very special. Because I worked as a graduate student while he was a university professor, and he took enormous care in spending maybe a couple of hours a week with me, and really dedicated and set aside time for me when I wasn't understanding a whole lot of things, and he would be very patient and explain things. I want to thank Naomi Stein for being here. I think it's appropriate. I'm so happy that you're here. I want to formally say thanks to my chair and doctoral advisor, guru, if you will, Claudia Colton. I'm using that word guru in all of its very deep sense. The Sanskrit word guru is not just about somebody who chaired your doctoral thesis. It is much more than that, who keeps on giving and mentoring. So every time I'm with Claudia, even if it's a few minutes these days, here and there, I'm very proud, and I'm very happy that she was my chair. There are many who are not here, like Pranab Chatterjee, Howard Goldstein, Tom Holland. Some of you will not recognize those names, but those of you who do know what I'm talking about. Art Bloom, Marv Rosenberg, Ruby Purnell. So I'm thinking of all of them while I give this talk here. But I'm also thinking about this very special man, Herman Stein, and I want to sort of start with something that he wrote me, just to illustrate how much time he took to think about my whereabouts and where I was going. Here's a letter. Probably many of you, Naomi, you won't know this, but this is, I had to cut it. It doesn't show university professor and all. But here's a letter he wrote to me in Bangkok. I was in transit, really thinking about my entry into India to begin my doctoral field research, where he not only was wondering how I was doing, but already connecting me to Carl Erik Knudsen, who was actually heading UNICEF's work. And this is how he corresponded with a student who could be just one of those people just passing through his offices for who he was. And I think it is that kind of care, and that's the total education you want to seek when you come to a university. And that's what I got, and Herman Stein, Professor Stein, represented that for me, along with my faculty here at MSAS. But in remembering Professor Stein, I'm also thinking about all the work he did in sub-Saharan Africa. He used to tell me stories about Tanganyika. And the problem I'm going to talk to you about today is something that he experienced, he saw. And things haven't changed very much on the ground, unfortunately, for about 3 billion people who are still energy impoverished, who are poor, but also energy poor. And it's this intersection that causes great many problems for these 3 billion that I've focused in the last 10, 15 years of my work, in trying to understand, not just in saying this is a problem, but rather offering some new ways of thinking about this problem. And so it's interesting that this work that I'm going to present is something that I know he thought about, because particularly he was very worried about children and women, and they are in the crosshairs of this problem even today. So my talk is really about this 3 billion, and then how do we use transdisciplinarity and translation to really think about this 3 billion. And I have to tell you, photography is by Mark Katzman and myself, mostly Mark Katzman. You know, photography is my other passion. And so I did this book to really for policymakers and others who wouldn't know this problem, combining science with photography to show people what the problem looks like. Now, this is an issue of 3 billion people who we need not feel sorry for. What we need to be doing is really rising up to the challenge to figure out the best science and the best practice interventions we can bring to, in collaboration with them, to resolve and address problems in collaboration with them. Because these are a very proud 3 billion. They're not someone we have to feel sorry for, because they're going about living their lives on a daily basis, doing what they need to be doing, securing, right, a present and hopefully a future for their families. But in doing what they do to secure the present, they're squandering their future, because they're setting aside their health concerns, and particularly women and children sacrifice a whole lot in dealing and addressing with energy impoverishment and energy poverty. So I'm going to give you a sense of that. And the first thing I want you to get a good sense of this is, what does it look like on a daily basis for women who live on very crude sources of energy? What does a daily hunt for fuel look like, right? I was in the middle of a forest with about 12, 13 women, each one of them securing what they need for their home. And all the crickets and everything. This is real ambient noise from a forest in Orissa when I was actually doing this book. That's how it feels. That's the hard work you have to do. That's the burden, physical and otherwise. But what they're doing, as I said, they're going about their business as proud, very proud people, supporting their families, doing what they need, and nothing more than that. But in the process, they not only shoulder the weight of this kind of fuel that they're carrying out of forests, tumbling out of forests, but they're also carrying the weight and the burdens of social norms, because they've been tasked in their cultures, in their homes, in their families, to precisely secure this, to maintain and support their families. So how do you carry these double, triple burdens and still expect to live a full, productive life with some leisure time left for you? You cannot. And this is the other part of this story. When you think about all these other elements of energy and impoverishment and all that, it's these double, triple burdens on women and children that are daily placed. And that's what I really wanted to focus on in not only in my research, but really look at what are the new approaches we can take. Now, what's interesting is when these women come home, and Terry mentioned Shanta. Shanta also did her PhD here under Claudia. Now, Shanta's focus was really on this area of work of why are women cooking in very traditional stoves, and can we, in those days, in the 80s, the focus is really on shifting technologies and getting to more efficient technologies so that we could protect the environment as well as women's health. But this approach now, the emphasis now is also on health, because we know that a 7-month pregnant woman like this, cooking 4 hours a day, 2 in the morning, 2 hours in the evening, is really breathing in very fine particulate matter. And some of the work I'm doing now is with aerosols groups around the country, including at WashU, that is measuring these, not only aerosols that, and particulate matter that they're ingesting, but when they shift to other fuels to substitute, like kerosene, the fine particulate matter crosses the blood organ barrier and affects, fetus and other aspects of a pregnant woman's health. So it is this burden of health, in addition to environment, in addition to livelihoods, in addition to personal burdens on women, that this entire work around 3 billion implicates. And I think you can begin to see why social work as a field actually has a very big role in this. Because we cannot understand this as a problem of energy. We have to understand this in its full spectrum, in all of its nuance. And that's the case I'm making. But at the same time, we also have to understand it in the sense that we as a profession, as a field, both generating scholarship and science around this problem and also training students to practice with communities like this, we have to understand the limits of our profession. Because our allegiance has to be to the problem and to the populations we're serving, not to what the boundaries of the profession are. And if that's the case, then we have to sometimes say that we have limits in any given profession as to how well we can address a problem. So if we understand the limits of our profession, but we understand the problem really well in all of its nuance, then it gives us an entry point into other disciplines. And it gives us a central place to bring along other disciplines to understand the problem in its full complexity. And that's the case, really, by the end of the talk, I want to make. And this is, again, very reflective of some of the conversations I used to have with Professor Stein. Now, the last point I want to make about crossing disciplines from the field of social work. If we don't cross disciplines in figuring out, and I said this to the students last night, either we are naive about our abilities to solve a problem or address a problem sustainably, or we're arrogant about our abilities to address a problem. I think on both counts, we wouldn't be doing well if we really want to address the vulnerabilities of the 3 billion. Just a quick set of numbers again. In the aggregate, if you just move away from any one person or household, in the aggregate, if you look at the toll this kind of energy poverty takes, you're talking about the disability-adjusted life years that are enormous. You look at that number for South Asia, 276 million deaths and 41.7 million, disability-adjusted life years. That's essentially a metric for years of life lost due to premature mortality in a population, right? With years lost due to disability from this kind of air pollution, both household and ambient. Okay, so this problem, and I'll show you a couple more slides on this. So this is essentially air pollution deaths that are attributable to both ambient and household, right? And if you look at this data from India and China, the two countries most populous, right? 1.5 million and 1.7 million deaths in India and China in 2013. Right? And those numbers have not significantly dropped. And if you look at this circle down here on the left, air pollution is responsible for 5.5 million deaths in 2013 worldwide. This is a significant issue, and at the center of it are people's behavior and poverty. And if you look at that, 85%, it's the number 4 problem. Air pollution is the number 4 highest ranking issue when it comes to death globally, right? And 85% of people live in places where they don't even meet WHO standards for air quality. Right? They can't even think about those things, right? And if you look at the green circle, I don't know whether you can properly see this. I really had great difficulty with this slide. You'll see that coal burning, wood burning, dung burning, power generation, transportation, agriculture, ocean dumping, household air pollution, all of these are implicated. And if you look at many of these, at the center is poverty driving these behaviors. And so these are very tightly coupled, these problems. So we cannot address air pollution just with a technical fix. You have to think about what is this complicated aspect of people's behavior and livelihoods that is at the center of this. So the key here is to understand everyday acts. It's in the everyday acts that you have to understand to figure out this problem, whether it is in women collecting, whether it is in women cooking, whether it is in the way these livelihood systems are being shaped every day by these behaviors. All of those you have to understand. You have to understand the fragility of people's lives. So if you look at this, here's a woman from western part of India in the Kutch region where, and this is an interesting example of why this transdisciplinarity is important. The complexity is humongous. So over the last 20 years, this community that relies on milking water buffaloes is unable to do that because of the landscape changes that cannot support their cattle, because of lots of invasive species that have taken up. Now, that's not my field, but ecologists who are working with me have done some work on that. So what now they have done is, what is my alternative for livelihoods? The alternative for livelihoods is to make the best in the landscape you're living in. So you take the invasive species, which is mesquite from Mexico, that was introduced through some really well-intentioned but not well thought through policies of the government to restore ecosystems, and they introduced trees such as mesquite. Now they're taking over the grasslands and you can't support cattle. So now they cut down mesquite and burn them and make coal to supply it to peri-urban areas as a way of making living. In that process, you not only are supplying coal to peri-urban areas, which is bad, not only for the climate, but for all those people who are burning it for their daily energy needs, right? But it takes, the pyrolytics that's involved, the chemistry and the physics of making coal requires this kind of slow burning. For days, 5-6 days in a row, they're tending these mounds under which are these tree trunks that are turning into coal. That is devastating for women, just being enveloped in such smoke. And you see the dynamic interplay between livelihoods, ecosystem changes, and how you begin to shift, because you have to put food on the table. So how do you intervene in populations like this, right? You have to understand the fragility of people's lives. You have to understand the ripple effects, right? The ones that I was just laying out, the causal chains of why somebody shifts from a certain type of livelihood that's seemingly sustainable in a rural area over a 15-year period. Time is another element in all of this that we have to think about when we're working with communities, along with other causal chains that are at play here. Such as, you take a picture like this. This is in drylands of southeastern India, where someone's growing peanuts. Now, if you look at the forests all around, they're denuded. Now, the aquifers, these are all rain-fed. So that means if the monsoon fails, essentially you don't have your daily income or your monthly income, or your annual crop. But when monsoons fail, you can actually go to the aquifers, right? Groundwater that we use a lot in the US. But groundwater takes an effect when surrounding hills are not covered, with tree cover and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things that are at play here. And here's just a quick, these photographs are probably not coming through well. I'm not so sure because of ambient light, but that's fine. All right, but you have to persist. You've got to make a living on these fragile landscapes. So that means you essentially continue to redouble your behaviors. You work harder, you work longer, you shift to maybe goat herding. That's even worse for the local environment. So you're slowly in a downward spiral, trying to figure out how to get out of it, right? So the point I think I've made enough here is we have to engage in complex problems, and you have to understand the full complexity. So here, let me turn to what we must do, in universities. And it's when we talk about translational and transdisciplinary research, it's not just another new thing, just, throwing it out there to look good. I think there's real merit and reason for us to be thinking about this, and particularly in schools of social work, when our focus, our crosshairs are clearly focused on populations experiencing certain problems. And I think when we focus on problems and the populations experiencing those problems and understand those problems, then I think we have actually staked some real ground to bring other disciplines along for translational work. So take this example that I've been talking about, right? Energy, environment, and air, affecting food and water, affecting health, affecting sustainable livelihoods. So if you think of that as one example of a complex problem, right? We in the universities are doing a lot of research. I mean, there are people at Case in the environmental studies department and engineering that are doing multiple different aspects of it. And so in the School of Medicine, right? But a lot of that, and I'm borrowing some terminology from the medical sciences, what they call is T1 or Translational Science, right? Which is fundamental discoveries. So that means if you have a lot of this kind of particulate matter that is emitted and you ingest it, these are the outcomes. You know the causal connection, you've established it really well, you know the science, you have the evidence. Now, the question about T1 science is it then results in certain interventions to see if you reduce the air pollution, does it improve your health, right? So then you're piloting some initial interventions to reduce air pollution, maybe a combustion device, a clean device that burns well, and so on and so forth. Now, but universities do those well, T1 and T2 science. The issue for us is, how do we go from T1 to T2 to populations at a different level, right? How do we go into the practice arena? And this is where professions like ours come in very, very quickly into focus. That is, how do we take it to T3? In T3 translational research stage, we seek to understand how an intervention works in real-world settings. That's our wheelhouse. That is, we can take stuff that's going on in the universities and try it out with populations and communities and so on. It need not be around this problem that I'm talking to you to illustrate today, but it could be anything. It could be a whole bunch of other things. It could be a microfinance intervention. Rather than being, sort of missionary about an intervention, let's be very hard-nosed about interventions. I know we fall in love with interventions, but we have to be very careful sometimes, because eventually what we're underscoring is it really helping the populations that we want to work with and change lives? So that T3 work is very important. That is, how do we take it and look to see how it works in real-world settings. Do we know enough about the barriers and the enablers of this kind of technology in real-world settings? From there, we really eventually, and this is again professions like ours and public health and other places, and particularly ours, I think we have a case to make where how do we take some of these technologies that we've shown to work and really use dissemination and implementation science to realize population-level benefits. And that is the stuff of T4 translational research. And I think, again, professions like ours, I want to make a case here, is that professions like ours should be at the center of it, should play a greater role. And we are given a lot of technologies, whether they're sort of social technologies, policy interventions, or hard like engineering technologies. But all of these are not self-implementing. You need humanly designed, devised institutions. That's our merit. That's the way we do, right? In the profession of social work. So we should feel proud and secure about where we fit in this kind of transdisciplinarity. So universities do well on T1, T2, but for innovation interventions in the practice arena, we need to do better in T3, T4. And that's really what I'm trying to do and my team is trying to do at Boston College, and what I was doing at WashU is really figure out how do we do this education piece that combines research with practice and not build these false divides and dichotomies. Because it's when we bring this together when the discipline, I think, can move to the next very flourishing stage. So that's my case for transdisciplinarity and transcending disciplines. And I think, and I will show you just quickly some examples of how we're doing this. So you have to educate students in this kind of work. That means we've got to put more of our students not in study abroad programs that they just go, in my case, because of this nature of this problem, that they just go and experience something, but rather we've got to put students to work in long-term projects and collaborators where they come in on things that are working already, that are on course in a 10, 15-year process unfolding. So then they're getting a snapshot of it, but at the same time, they're getting some really tough training while they're getting schooled in the field. So one of the ways we think about all this is, in this complexity, is to ask the question, where does the problem lie, right, in all of this work? And there are lots of models from implementation science. Like, let's say I want to actually implement renewable solar for the poor, right? It sounds so great, right? But you have to understand household factors. You have to understand community factors. You have to understand provider and supply chain factors. Then you have to understand how that intervention is working in light of all these, while all along figuring out what are the policy supports and enabling conditions. Is the government supporting it, right? And at the top, is this really an evidence-based technology that actually works? A lot of times, people are not stupid. They abandon technology because it doesn't work. As simple as that, right? So you have to understand not only that something is evidence-based and clean, but it's aware, they're aware that it's affordable, accessible. And then once they adopt, that's just the beginning. Are they implementing it like the way you do smartphones, right? All of us charged our phones last night because so we're productive today. But we changed our behavior sometime 15 years ago to do that. That means we have implemented new behavioral regimes into our own lives that are now part and parcel of the way we live. How can we enable communities that are now not doing what we're doing in terms of all the positive behaviors that we have incorporated also into their lives, right? But it's easy to put up a diagram like this, but really don't understand the causal chains. So one approach we're using is bringing systems thinking to it. Because what you see is just the tip of the iceberg. A whole lot of stuff is happening underneath that is not visible to you, right? That people are acting on. People's mental models, their preferences. You can't see that. You have to dig deeper. You got to find methods. And I think we have an approach in social work we can do that. Because a lot of times we are focused on discrete events. And maybe sometimes patterns of events. Right? But discrete events and patterns of events are not sufficient. What you really need to understand is what is the system structure that is driving these patterns of events and discrete events? What is producing those events? Right? If you really want to get to the root cause, you have to get to the system structure. And so my good fortune has been not just to have a great committee that has prepared me well here, but my good fortune has been to have colleagues around me at WashU that taught me many, many things. And then were open to going places when I challenged them. So Peter Hovmand, who is the head of Social System Design Lab, good friend of mine, a colleague, still working together, began thinking about, can we do system dynamics to figure out this structure of feedback behaviors that underlie a problem, rather than just looking at the events and the symptoms problems. So we, over time, having worked in India and Mongolia and other places, devised a method called community-based system dynamics. Essentially, to do so I challenged Peter one day saying, this is great. This is all MIT stuff you just brought to WashU. Engineers and others sit down in nice rooms and figure out problems, right? But what if we do this kind of work with communities? And that's how it began. In trying to figure out how to do this with communities, we iterated and used design thinking to, every time we would take lessons of what works, what doesn't work, incorporate it into the next iteration. And it's still going on. So what we do in India, we'd bring it back to St. Louis, try it with communities in St. Louis, and then take those lessons and iterate them out to India. So it's that kind of design thinking that we used for about 10 years before this method came about. And the idea here is that we want to understand the mental models that are operational in driving behavior of those embedded in the social dilemmas. We hope to get some of the root causes of adoption, sustained implementation, and maintenance in rural households by understanding how people who are in the middle of these decisions act and behave. And why do they abandon? Why don't they abandon? What's causing? And we do this work in communities like this that are really living at the margins, with women like this that are very traditional, will not come out to community meetings, but we partner, as I said before, with organizations and nonprofit agencies and non-governmental organizations, and sometimes even very local governments that have been in these communities for 10, 15, 20 years. And we bring them together and we start putting together trends over time with them, using a whole lot of participatory research action methods, right? PAR methods, PRA methods. And we use the qualitative methods to eventually get to simulation models. But the qualitative methods are great because it allows us to derive the kind of information we need from them to then feed it back to the community to say, is this what is going on, right? So there's a process where they drive and then we reflect back. So here we are building what is called a reference mode, essentially a graph over time. And here we never build models of systems because that's a losing battle. It's a slippery slope. You should never do that, right? At least in my opinion. You have to build a structure of systems that are driving a problem that you want to alleviate. And then the problem has to be selected by the community that it thinks is the significant problem. And there could be multiple, 3 or 4 or 5 problems that are interrelated. But you got to start and dive into one key problem that they see. If someone says, we don't have enough food in a month, that's a problem. There's traction there for us. And then let's say over the 5 years, on a monthly basis, how many days are you able to eat 2 square meals a day? I mean, with this population, you cannot do 3. 2 is enormous. So then they will tell you, well, in a month, I'm able to have 2 square meals a day about 17 days. And the rest of the 13 days, I eat about 1 meal, right? So you see how then we draw these. Whatever the problem is, we get these trend lines over. Then we begin to drill into the narrative of why that is that trend and what are the causes for that trend. And people know their problems. People will tell you exactly when something is a reason for why on the 18th day they didn't have food that month. And it varies, but over time you'll get to some reasons. So this is how you do a behavior over time graph. So this is just another shot of that. So there's a reference mode. So what here, you can look at the green line as something. Think of an example of your own, right? Something that's been taken up that is good over time and stabilized. So it means all the children in that community are getting vaccinated, as an example. Here it's uptake of clean energy. But let's say all the children in one village have taken up and people are keeping it up. But in the other community, people have initially taken up when the public health programs came in, community development people came in, and then after several years, that behavior started going down. Now that becomes the starting point for us to compare these two communities. What is happening in that community with that green line, and what are the structure of feedback processes that are at play that are keeping people from in maintaining that behavior, whereas not in this other community. So then we redo these, right? We take it from the community, we bring it back, we redo these reference modes, and then begin to engage people in a narrative and start doing causal diagrams with them. And this is how a causal diagram that we did in real time in a community looks like in a local language. And we always, I was telling students that we always do this work not in English, but in the local language. That means you need to have very strong partners. Doing something in local language does two things. One, it clearly indicates that they are in control, and you're actually in a very vulnerable position as someone doing this work, because you're not understanding everything that's going on a minute-by-minute basis. And that's a great position for them to see you in as a professional, that too from outside. Because when they see you there, they know your vulnerability, because they sense it after a while, because you're trying to figure out what's going on here, and you don't understand it for 30 minutes at a time, and then someone translates it for you, right? It's a good position to put ourselves in as practitioners, as researchers, to be in that vulnerable state, to understand many times when people are coming and lecturing to them about, this is what you ought to be doing, right? And then we reflect it back to communities. And multiple communities, not just one. We purposely separate women, and then because many times men won't give the space for women to talk. So we a lot of times separate them. And then we take it back to the full community. And when we take it back to the full community, it becomes a de facto men's meeting, as you can see. So then women are in the periphery, and then men are in the middle. So once we get this verified, then we begin to think about building the model. So the whole approach is problem definition, developing the reference mode, eliciting the structures, going back and integrating the model structures, and then getting the feedback on if we got the model somewhat right, the causal pathways, and then using different software like Winsome and Stella and others to prepare the causal models and eventually simulation modeling, right? So then we simulate. And what we do is essentially create over time graphs in the simulation that a set of structural feedback mechanisms are producing. Once you know that these mechanisms are producing this trend over time, then you can intervene in different pathways to see cost effectively if in fact we're able to change system behavior. And here let me make one very important point, which is a lot of times we're intervening in behavioral and feedback mechanisms that are long gone, that are not at play. 10 years ago something was in play, you heard that story, or I heard that story, and I'm thinking that it's still at play. But no, there's an entire set of other feedback processes have now taken over. So there is a loop dominance change. That is, a set of structures that were really prominent 10 years ago are no longer driving this behavior. It's another set of new behaviors that are driving. It's very important to understand what is current and what is not. And that's part of the purchase for simulation, is that when you intervene, sometimes you don't see any change. There's policy resistance or program resistance, and we see this all the time. That's because we're intervening on a very wrong set of causal pathways that were really important at some point in the past. Okay, I think I'm going to rush here. Let's see. We've done a lot of work on this, and I'm going to show you a few things. In fact, some of the work, this is the model that we built using, we're just about to send it for publication, the simulation model. But what you see here is stocks and flows. So there's, no, this is not the right diagram to show. Yeah. What we're trying to do here is understand in systems the three stocks of people. Those who are using traditional stoves. How do we move them? So you can think of as those who are not taking their kids for vaccination. Think of an example. Then families using both traditional and clean cooking, or families using both traditional medicine and advanced medicine, right? Because people don't abandon what they're familiar with. That is risk-free, in the sense that it's a tried and tested method, right? But then how do you eventually move everybody in that middle stock to that last stock that is predominantly using something that is good for you, right? But in this method, what we also know is we know people actually revert back to old behaviors. So we have pathways where people abandon behaviors, abandon technologies, abandon things you've given them, right? And then they fall back into families, back to traditional ways. So it is this dynamic we want to model and figure out what is driving stocks of people from moving from one stock to the other stock and sustaining in that last stock. Right? Once we, when people talk about inflection points, that's precisely what we want to do. We want to actually figure out how eventually when people move to that last stock, will not revert back. What happens, right? And, in this case, what we're beginning to find in our modeling is that word of mouth is very important, but what's also important is, in fact, I don't have it here, do I? Yeah, this one. If you see here, what's also important is the community where I showed you the green line, women endogenized all the technical understanding around supporting methane digesters in this community. So they don't have to go outside to fix problems when they have it in their homes. They actually share that knowledge and widely disseminate it in the community. Plus, what you don't see in here, I'll tell you one other structure that we don't have it here. Men who have seen these really positive effects in their households because of women shifting to better technologies and maintaining it, begin to see that their household is functioning much better, everything's clean, women are happier, and so on. So when new brides come into the communities, what's happening in this community is that the other men tell this young husband, you better make sure that your wife is getting all the things that our wives have. Because there's a shift now from women's gendered networks to more prestige effects in the men's networks that we also can model, because we actually figured that out through some modeling, But so men are now putting pressure on, for young brides on their husbands to do right by their wives. So that's an interesting thing in a very traditional society. You want that. You want all of that converging towards these positive outcomes. I'm going to skip a few of these. So what we do is once we have this model, we actually then can simulate. We produce these curves. So these are the two curves. One in the, let me see here. Let me go to the last slide. Yeah. So here you have two curves, right? One is families using clean cooking technologies over time. So in 2005, when it was introduced, it was spiking, and then it started falling. And then we go way out into 2030 in the simulation, right? So then, because of the structure, I said repair and that technology, if it's embedded in the community, right, is important. And another element of that structure that we didn't go through very properly is that external encouragement and recognition that the community is doing well is very important. People have mentioned that. So what we said, okay, what if we gave people repair and encouragement, right? What happens is there's a spike, and you see that red line. There's sort of they're both red. I don't know, the red that's going down. It initially spikes, and then over time, maintenance of that technology just goes down. So it doesn't have as much of a purchase. But if we do repair encouragement plus embed technical support within the community, you begin to see that it spikes and sustains that behavior. So then we have to go back out into the community to test these in real world. But we quickly can, through the simulation models, figure this out, at least some possible hypotheses for us to go and work around the stuff that they have actually indicated to you. You're not developing interventions that are outside the realm of what they've talked about as working and not working. Similarly, right now I've just started this project working with Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay, where they're all engineers. So what they're now looking for is behavioral science and implementation science. So we at BC, I'm building a team there now. We're using system science and implementation science. They're implementing 1 million solar lamps so that girls in rural areas in India can actually study and reduce kerosene use, because kerosene, as I said, is very bad. So can we introduce solar lamps and really take care of those two things? A simple technology, right? So they're deploying 1 million lamps across multiple states in the central tribal belt of India. So what we are doing now is actually developing models based on their implementation, where we are building models. This is called a LAS framework. This is right now in preparation. I'm showing you stuff that's very, very current and raw. So localization, L for localization, A for affordability, and S for saturation. Because you need to, one of their ideas is we got to localize the production, the uptake, the awareness, everything. It cannot be all coming from the outside. So that means in localizing production of a technology that is good for the poor, you also generate jobs, you also generate awareness, you generate a buzz, right? So then you deal with affordability and so on. So in all those three, and they're linked in a feedback set of mechanisms. So I'll show you quickly. So here's the feedback, here's a structure, just a very 30,000 level set of structures for localization. They're working with NGOs, local NGOs, building their capacity in developing trainings for assembly, local sales, local repair, and supply chain functioning to expand the number of solar lamps available to rural areas that are off-grid. Right? So if we are going to eventually understand if this technology is going to be useful for girls and homes, we also have to understand where it's falling apart or doing well. So we're building now with them these. And then You have a bunch on affordability. Affordability is not just about initial price. It's also about maintenance costs. How far do you have to go to fix something? Such a simple rudimentary technology like solar lamp can't be breaking down too fast, right? So there's a bunch of things that we have to think about there so that we can actually increase the flows of affordability. Increasing as affordability increases, the stock, right, of affordability also goes up. Then you've got saturation. That is, if you don't cover, let's say, a district with 100,000 lamps, you're not going to see larger effects of contagion. You're not going to see larger environmental effects. You cannot just have one house here, another house there, right? So saturation is a big, and this idea is actually has taken, it's now the most important thing when you want to do stuff at the behavioral level in communities, but also get environmental and climate impacts, because you need saturation. You can't just be feeling good that I've touched 10 communities and 1,000 people, 10 households, 100 households in each. You see, that's not enough. So we have a challenge, and we know this from other stuff around public health interventions and social interventions, that saturation is important. How do communities turn a corner? So if you put all this together, it looks like this. So don't worry about it. We're not going to, right? But one thing we're unpacking is all the supply chain issues. So we're now working with that team to figure out on the ground where the bottlenecks are, where things are working. Another is how supply chain and repair places that they're establishing are working to support households with solar lamps. How is localization happening, right? How is local capacity being built up? How is localization connected to supply chain? And how is affordability, right? Structures and saturation. So what is driving adoption and saturation? So what you have is a large set of feedback mechanisms with subsystems that you have to focus on. And let me return to this idea. If you have a complex problem at hand that involves human behavior, which muddies everything, you've got to have this kind of hard-nosed approach that takes time. You cannot do this overnight. You can't just go in and start building models in our offices, but you have to take these out and test them in communities. That's what is required for sustainable interventions, right? And what's the road ahead then for the profession? I think that there's only one path. We've got to do differently in our education, in our research, and in the way we develop practice interventions and test them and train current and future generations of people in the universities. And that means we have to engage them in these kinds of projects. We have to engage them at a very different level, not just lectures and so on and so forth. Really have courses that are embedded in projects like this. I mean, that would be my dream curriculum in a school of social work. But hopefully we'll get it done, and at least definitely, hopefully at Boston College. We're going to hit a lot of roadblocks, and there'll be transdisciplinarity is not easy. Everybody wants to stake their ground, saying this is the way. We're all coming in from our normative perspective, right? Like this is the way. This is the solution. Why didn't they listen to me? Engineers are always telling me that. It's like, I've got it. Why don't you just educate? I hate that word. When somebody says, educate the people, just tell them that this is there, right? As if they don't know it. But in spite of the roadblocks, we got to move onward, right? We have to trek through rough terrain sometimes. And the reason why onward is important is it is women like these who are living very dignified lives in extreme poverty, taking risks at the margins. They're taking risks at the margins, but plowing on. There is no reason for us in resource-rich environments not to do better, because they're going to rise up to the challenge if we make them our collaborators. Thank you.
We've
got Mike here for questions for anybody who has them, so just find the mic.
Thank you, Gal. I love to see your work and to see you back here at Mandel School. I have a question about sustainability with your community groups, and if you could talk a little bit about, it seems that you've kind of trained some trainers and how you've used those trained people to continue the work in other communities.
Yeah. So all of this work is not easy to do where you airdrop in, right? So you've already guessed it. So I have some really great partners. In this project, I have IIT Bombay as a partner, but more importantly, what IIT Bombay does not have, which I'm lucky to have, my group is lucky to have, is a partner. There's an NGO in India that just won about 2 years ago, Jeff Skoll's Innovation Award. And they've been working in 7 states of India with very poor, in 9,000 communities for a long time, for about 20, 22 years. For the last 10, 11 years, I've been there, we've been partners. And so we don't just airdrop in. What we have now done is we have embedded this work in that organization. So in fact, the current work that I didn't show is funded by Packard Foundation to them, not to us. But they've invited us, because we're longstanding partners, to model social and ecological and livelihood systems with this population. That is, how are they making decisions when livelihoods are at the intersections of frayed ecosystems, very, social systems that are traditional, or right, and economic systems that are not. So how do you think about it? So they are bringing us into the communities. They have credibility with not only communities, but with local governments. So that's how you do this. And in fact, the organization has made a commitment to becoming a systems thinking organization. So right from their village teams to the CEO, they have taken it upon themselves to do this work with us. And the other thing I didn't show you, for 5 years, continuously, every winter, I ran a course out of WashU with Foundation for Ecological Security in India, where second-year MSW students, no doctoral students, by the way, second-year MSW students, bachelor's systems engineering students, anthropology students, environmental studies students, and other disciplines would come. And the doctoral students always would be TAs because they were studying systems. And we did this course with this NGO, with our students and their staff, with communities in charge of modeling a problem. So, but it was always the central focus of the course was built around the needs of the communities and the work that this organization was doing. So that's how we've been doing this.
So to follow up, you answered part of the question I had, and that is your engagement of students. I know you mentioned bachelor's and master's students in this process, and so what was the role of the student? What kinds of roles do students take on, and how long are the students engaged in this activity so that they are moving from being voyagers of poverty as opposed to being a part of a systems process?
Yeah. So for students to take this course, there's a very rigorous selection process. First, you have to take the first course in system dynamics. You have to take a course in what is called group model building. Then the third course is the course in India. And you would have had to do well in the other 2 courses and earned your spot. And so then what happens is you spend 12 days. Generally, days start around 8 in the morning, go till 9, 10, 11 in the evening as the course progresses, because what we do is we also innovated in the way we do these lectures. So because they already have a background, what we do is we develop a problem scenario that is generally, these are the problems in this region that you're going to study, this NGO is working on. So then the first thing is we have an orientation meeting on the first day when they arrive in India, and then that evening they go visit the community. And the community has a gathering. We've already worked with the community. It's a lot of work, actually. The community already then orients the students and the staff and everybody as to some of the issues that they're dealing with. And so it's just a reconnaissance. Then they come back, and then we have in the morning, we get together, and then every group, there are, let's say, 15 students in 4 groups. So there are 4 different communities that they're going to. So a lot of logistical arrangements here. And then when they come back, they all talk about their problem, and they begin to work on their reference modes. That behavior over time graph, the problem that they've heard the night before. They go back to the community. So first 2-3 days, all they're doing is developing the problem over time. And then they begin to elicit stories using all these methods. So when they're spending all day in the field, and they come back at 6 p.m., have dinner, and start working at 8 p.m. And students like late nights, so at least I'd like to think. So they're working till midnight, 1 a.m., modeling. And then they go to the field again. So there's this iteration. So in between, they get stuck. Tensions mount, pressures build, because they're not able to, they think the problem they heard is a certain way, but the community is saying no when they verify it. So when the pressures mount, we devised a new pedagogical technique. We never do long lectures. We do these micro 10-minute lectures. So what we do is suddenly Peter Huffman might lecture on a particular way of modeling a structure that you can take from somewhere else that has been done, and he will show that. It suddenly opens up a window for that group to do something. And I will probably lecture something for 10 minutes on some of the connections between livelihood systems and local ecosystems and the ramping burdens on women, or whatever it is, for them to make sense of what's happening. So these are like 10-minute, very concentrated interventions. And then we unleash them back into the modeling process. See? So this goes on for like 12 days. And it's much more than a course. It's actually should be more than 3 credits. But in between, we take 1 break where we have a nice party in the evening with bonfire and all that. Everything's released. They go back to work. But these are high transactions courses. But somehow we have to. This is where I think, while we're taking that, this is where I think cross-university collaborations in social work have to now become the next way of doing things, because we all don't have the right resources to do it on our own. Yeah.
Hi, I was just curious about the time frame of all of this, because I can tell it's ongoing, it's iterative, it's clearly takes a lot of time, but if you could just walk us through roughly that time frame.
Yeah. Different projects, right? The ICTS project, I had a project funded by Institute for Clinical and Translational Sciences. That was funded in 2013, but it was funded, and then there's an NIH grant, a trial that we're doing with systems modeling that we just finished after 4 years. Then this 2013 one, we've just made sense of some of the simulations because we want to go back to the communities. It takes time. You cannot just, we were talking about it before. You can't just go do this and then tomorrow morning turn out a manuscript and send it off. Because first of all, it would not be responsible because we don't have the full understanding. But so it takes time. So this one with IIT, they've been implementing for some time, for the last 3-4 years. Now we're coming in because they just received some new funding where they're going to do a second round of implementation of another 1 million lamps. But because of the interactions, what we have done is we've said, well, why don't we understand these in all of these issues that we've been talking. So I'm assuming for the next 4 or 5 years we'll be working on this. I'd like to look at these as decadal works, where you're developing generation of students and teams in your university setting.
So how much time do you spend in country
to
sustain the relationship?
You mean now, or I used to so far, right?
Well, give us, just to have a sense of what your connection is to the whole process.
Yeah, it's in fact, it has taken, I have to be honest with you, it takes a toll. Because I still spend I used to spend until last July a lot of time in the field, in these communities. So all that stuff you've seen, I've gone to many of these sessions just to make sure things are, and when doctoral students are working with you in the field, they love it because they know that you're not just telling them to do something, but you're also experiencing the same difficulty. So, which I hadn't realized, but I began to understand. Now, increasingly now, what I've done is because of some of those students who have trained under this are now coming into the faculty ranks. My goal is to draw them into the faculty ranks, build that team so that I can, my bandwidth is now pretty stretched. But I want to focus still. I think, Cleve, you have to tell me otherwise. I see myself first and foremost as a colleague, because I think that's really where we earn our credibility as a dean, to be a faculty colleague. So that means I've kept my research, but more importantly, what I want to do is build a team, lead some of the major pieces of it, but leave it to the next generation for the implementation of this on a daily basis. So, but it's high transactions.
Well, somebody else, let's take them up.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why it was easy for me to do the book, because then I went to my all project sites and then did the book.
Yeah, I just wondered if you could speak more about the institutional collaboration you mentioned between universities.
Yeah. So, the other thing that I did not emphasize, I just kind of hinted at or maybe talked about in different ways. I said that to address complex problems, we need transdisciplinary orientation and a translational orientation. But how do you understand complex problems to transcend disciplines and to understand which disciplines are central to a problem? You understand that by being place-based. So this is the other cornerstone of the work we have to do. We have to be in a place in long stretches of time in enduring ways. And in being place-based, that means you have to understand the communities you're working with. You've got to be embedded with the organizations that are in that, the work that, again, I'll turn to, the school is doing in urban poverty and so on. That's place-based work, right? That is here. But it's harder to do in other locations outside. But we have to nevertheless do it because the returns to that are enormous. Many of them, you don't see them. You cannot overtly identify. But in being place-based, you begin to bring along partners. You begin to bring along partners to see differently the same old issues that they have not been able to address for a long time. And that's how you do it. It has to be place-based. And I think a university has to probably, or a school has to make commitments saying, okay, we're going to be in these 5-6 places, or we're going to be in Cleveland plus a couple of other places. Let's say in LA or in Boston, and then we're going to work across. So you have to you have to be intentional about it. I think. This is my opinion. So.
Thank you. My name is Muiwa. I'm a second-year MBA from the Weatherhead School. There's seemed to be an idea in your presentation that saturation, that S in the last framework, is required for sustained impact. My question is what you are saturating communities with, is it an innovation or an intervention like a product, or is it a process? Because you had talked also about introducing methods. And are you teaching communities how to think or how to solve complex problems, or are you bringing products to?
Couple of things on that. That's a very insightful observation, that you're not only saturating with, in that example, technology, but also maybe a process. But you're also saturating with an idea, an aspiration, right? That you can use a solar lamp that works for you, but then you probably can go up vertically in adding maybe a solar-powered fan that in the summer you can cool down. So it could be those things. But I want to come back to this other point. I'm not so sure I've ever been able to teach anything to anybody, because these communities that are living in extreme poverty know a whole lot about agronomy, about economics, about hydrology, about whatever you throw at them, because they're making decisions on all these dimensions. So all I have been able to do is really understand their approaches and perspectives, and then bring along hydrologists, right, let's say, from their normative point of view, their professional point of view, what is actually happening and why is this farmer thinking about the way water works this way? And they're acting. So by engaging a professional and someone who's acting on their understanding of a problem, you get collective insights for all of us to move past a discussion where we're seeing differently to how do we collaborate to think about, can we try this differently? And you do your way, and we can try this side by side and see if it works. So those are the things that I'm now thinking about experimenting with. That is, can we think of a social intervention? That is, I'll give you an example of a social intervention. A lot of very extremely remote communities in Western India have traditional community institutions where they actually assign people in a community to monitor wells to figure out the depth of water in aquifers, because it's very critical for their agriculture. And then they collectively manage those wells. But because of government policy of subsidizing technology to drill, so because politicians want to win elections, so then they say, okay, we'll subsidize the drilling technology if you want to drill for water. It has undermined the social institutions. So part of this agency that I'm working with is trying to reclaim the traditional institutions that are really about collaboration and collective action to get to that sustainable use and of resource. So part of what I have learned is the strength of those institutions, and when they're defunct, what it can look like, and the counterfactual. So to answer your question in a long-winded way, I think saturation is on multiple levels. It's not about me teaching anything. It is really collectively, collaboratively learning to get to a new place.
Yeah, you mentioned focus groups as being a very important part of this process. Could you say a little bit more about the development of the focus groups in the community? And also, is this a role that social workers could play in this process?
So in all of this, a lot of this work, we have trained MSW students to do this. So to your question, yes, right? Now, what is the nature of these focus group discussions we have? They're very focused in the sense that they're not general questions. They're about this one problem we collectively decide is the issue. And then we begin to develop a narrative with multiple tools on what is driving this problem. Why is this problem not going away? And so then in that, we use a suite of tools. So we might use a traditional technique of delineating historical events in that community, because a lot of people don't keep time in terms of 10 years ago this happened. But they will tell you when the first primary school was built in this community, we used to have this many households that did this. So when was that? So then you begin to get key events. So this is where I think we can bring our community organizing, community development, and other community mobilization skills to really do well on this. And I had 2 MSW students work in a community for 3 months before we did some of this work to really map out some of the problems with communities. And they, and I think that's where some of the advantages, come in. The last thing I'll tell you is we are trained to empower communities. So when there's a physical object with a trend line, and suddenly women at some point in the exercise take the pen from you and start drawing, that's when you have to give up and sit back. That's where the transfer happens. And I think that's a great, moment to teach our students when they're taking this and working in projects like this for their class. When that happens, to be aware of that.
Stein, I have a question so you develop the model, like where do you get the money to do this, And also, it seems it's really great, I totally agree with you, but people always lose patience. They want to see the productivity. So, like how can you show people, all the politicians, all the private funders, like how successful they are, So you talk about a woman start to write with their own pen. So for me, I say, oh, that's successful. But then how can you, use data to show the success?
I have a secret donor with $1 billion. So now, because it's secret, I can't tell you. Well, I think these are resource intense ways of thinking about it, right? Part of, Professor Farkas's question gets at your, worry, which is you have to have partners. You cannot, I'm not doing this from the US. I am partnering with local organizations that are doing such innovative work. Jeff's goal is giving them money. Money doesn't have to come to me to do this work. So that's also something we have to think differently, right? Jeff's goal is saying to them, yeah, do this, I like it, right? You're innovative. He's giving them money. Or some other, but we also have money from NIH, we have money from different, places cobbled together to do this work. And hopefully, one day we will have new sources. I'm thinking about several foundations. Like we actually, many of you must have heard the 100 and change MacArthur Challenge, right? Who hasn't, right? So I will confess openly, I was hoping that would be my money. And in fact, we did very well, believe me. We got a very high score for that project I just showed you. But we didn't get selected in the 8. I thought there were going to be 12, but they only selected 8. But they are hoping, I think they're going to connect me with others, so we'll see. Yeah.
Is there time? Well, this has been, for me, a very eye-opening and awesome presentation to see how far your work has come. And to hear it was a finalist for the, how much money?
I wasn't a finalist. We got a pretty good score. 100 million.
Or 100 million.
We got a score like 78 or
like
something.
Amazing.
It's not bad.
But that's my question is much more simple. I really like the systems design thinking and the curriculum I think you've built at WashU to underpin that. And my question is, like, just thinking over the next 10 years in the field of social work, systems design thinking has been around, but it seems like technology has really helped it, catapult forward. So how do you see social work incorporating this into our field, and is it very feasible? Would you see just a few places doing it? How would you see that happening?
Yeah. Let me sort of touch on the feasibility part. When you think about feasibility, money and putting in place a set of courses is the least of our problems. In university environments, feasibility is about it's a misalignment problem. That is, how do you teach to the current curriculum while you're shifting? And how do you radically shift the feasibility of that? That means you have to cut loose from some historical ways of doing things. So part of the feasibility question, because I'm struggling with it right now, and I'm thinking about this a lot, I'd love to engage you on a conversation on this. I don't know whether you agree with me on that, because I think we have certain ways of delivering curriculum in the universities, particularly in every school, whether it's MBA or social work, wherever. So I think that there's one constraint there. It's about our, it really is epistemological, right? The bottleneck is. Second is, then you have resource constraints. That means you've got to have enough people in the field, or you got to go out and bring people in to support that work. So that is a real tangible resource issue that we have to. But the third one, I will tell you, I'm only going to give you problems in this, because once you do it, it's great. The third problem here is this. Early on, Peter Huffman and I figured this out. In fact, Peter has a unique position in the field because he was trained as an engineer and got his PhD in social work, working on systems modeling of domestic violence cases in the legal system, court systems. And he's very wedded. He didn't want to go out and do systems consulting with Exxon and others, but rather do this in the field of social work. So someone like that, how do you produce more people like that? But even more importantly, something that he caught on very quickly when he was teaching system dynamics is that students from all over the campus would take it. And even social work students would take it. But the way a social work student would actually solve the system's problems were struggling to understand the causal mechanisms and so on. But an engineer would reverse engineer the problem. So they would get the model working by fixing the equations. But that's not what we want. So you see where there are epistemological and methodological issues even in the way you teach this. So I think those things come because if we just bring in from somebody who's not trained to think with communities, then you're going to get a whole lot of models and publications around models that are not going to mean much for people on the ground. But they're going to look great. I don't know whether I answered your question fully, but that is, so I think that's the constraint.
A lot to be done.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point to end this on, Claudia. There is a lot to be done, but certainly I want to thank Dean Yadama for a very stimulating presentation, and that he's embedded himself here for 2 days to help us to move forward and really look for challenges and perhaps some further connections that we'll have in the future with Boston College too on these type of challenges.
Absolutely.
So please join me in thanking him.